The next things we come to are baptism and sacrifice. We've already looked at Judaism now. The next two things we come to are baptism and sacrifice. You know what we've seen with circumcision, that circumcision is required. If there are exceptions, they are just that. They are not the rule. They are not the generally held practice. They are exceptions out in the diaspora. Let's come to baptism next of all. Now, I said in the earlier message that circumcision is the one big requirement because it's a sign of the covenant in the Old Testament. Baptism is probably the most interesting of the three. Interesting because some people question the actual existence of this rite, baptism, as being required for Gentile converts. And I guess they question it maybe because of Paul's silence, the book of Acts and his epistles in the New Testament. In other words, he never seems to deal with it in Acts or his epistles as he does circumcision from the Judaizing position. Now, we haven't looked at all of those verses. Let's take the time to look at a few of these and see what, well, I guess as we're looking at baptism, see what's not said here. Acts chapter 15, if you'll turn to Acts 15 and verse 1. Baptism is certainly the most interesting of them. Baptism, has by extension connections all the way over to the faith in which we are involved, Christianity, whereas circumcision and sacrifice of animals does not. Circumcision is just seen throughout the Old Testament. Where's baptism seen in the Old Testament? See, it's an interesting question. Where's baptism seen in the New Testament? That is for Jewish people, not converts to Christianity. Another interesting question. And we've already thrown out a few of these, just the general thought of baptism, which has heightened, I think, your interest. And I remember a few messages ago, it must have been, some of you were up discussing, the various baptisms. John had a baptism. Where did he get his baptism? The Essenes, the Essenic community, and the Dead Sea wilderness northwest of the Dead Sea seem to have their business of ritual washings. The Jews, even after the Romans had come and subdued Jerusalem, the Jews who held out almost to the very end up on top of the mountain there, and I've been on top of that, Masada. You've got all of these elaborate buildings there that have been proven, some of which anyway, have been proven by archaeological investigation to have served the purpose of ritual washings or baptisms. So why is it we don't see so much evidence in the New Testament? Paul is always combating the Judaizers over their circumcision bit. But what about their baptism bit? In other words, if these are Judaizers, and we're not finding them just in Jerusalem, we're finding them spread out over the empire here. They're trying to win people to their faith. Then what are the requirements the Judaizers put upon those they're attempting to win? Circumcision is certainly one, as we're going to see in these passages. What about baptism? If baptism was one, then why don't we see it here in all of these discussions? It doesn't seem like Paul ever gets into a discussion with the Judaizing element, an element behind some of his epistles, over the issue of baptism, just over the issue of circumcision. Acts 15:1. And certain men which came down from Judea taught the brethren and said, except ye be certain. Now came down, of course they've gone up to Antioch, but down spiritually. Jerusalem was the mother city. Certain men which went from Jerusalem and Judea up to Antioch in Syria taught the brethren and said, except ye be circumcised after the manner of Moses, ye cannot be saved. We've already given you a lot of information about circumcision and the important place it held in Old Testament theology. We certainly haven't looked at it in any depth or detail, but we've given you some of the details about that. And of course, we on the Gentile side of the issue, 2,000 years removed from this time, it's kind of like an academic question to us, Judaizers versus Pauline justification by faith. But had we been living during that time, our lives and our spiritual existence would certainly have been dependent upon the apostles, because we would be looking to them for true teaching. Because Judaizers are coming saying, be baptized, follow the law, or be circumcised, follow the law of Moses. Well, how can you find fault with that? That's what you'd been taught, you and I, as a Jew, for hundreds and hundreds and for 2,000 years. So we kind of look at it from a pedantic point of view, but it was very practical for them. When therefore Paul and Barnabas had no small dissension and disputation with them, they determined that Paul and Barnabas and certain other of them should go up to Jerusalem unto the apostles and elders about this question. And so verse 4, when they were come to Jerusalem, they were received of the church and of the apostles and elders. But there rose up certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed. Now that's important right there, that little phrase, the Pharisees which believed. Not unbelievers in Jesus, but believers. Certain of the sect of the Pharisees which believed, saying, same as the end of verse 1, that it was needful to circumcise them and to command them to keep the law of Moses. And so verse 6 kind of sets the scene for the first council of the church here at Jerusalem. The apostles and elders came together to consider of this matter. And we know what their conclusion is at, you get it down in verses 19 and 20, and even down into 21 there. Wherefore my sentence from James is that we trouble them not. Don't put a yoke on them that neither we or our fathers could bear, as Peter argued earlier here in this chapter. But that we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, fornication, things strangled from blood. Concerning Moses keeping his law, Judaizers concerned about Moses being forgotten. We've used this verse earlier to point out the widespread nature of the Jewish dispersion. For Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. We don't have to worry about Moses passing off the scene. He's in every city being read every Sabbath day. Okay, then Romans 2:25 to 29. We read that in the earlier message on circumcision. Romans 4. We'll read this now, 9 through 13. Romans 4, 9 through 13. I'm saying some question the existence of baptism as a rite because of Paul's silence on the matter. I mean, he certainly talks about baptism, but remember, it seems to always be from a Christian perspective. It's never with the background being the Judaizers. Paul asks, does this blessedness come upon the uncircumcision only, or the circumcision only, or upon the uncircumcision also? For we say that faith was reckoned to Abraham for righteousness. How was it then reckoned? When he was in circumcision or in uncircumcision? Not in circumcision, but in uncircumcision. And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had, yet being uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all them that believe, though they be not circumcised, that righteousness might be imputed unto them also. And so he says, the father of circumcision to them who are not of the circumcision only, but who also walk in the steps of that faith of our father Abraham, which he had being yet uncircumcised. For the promise that he should be heir of the world was not to Abraham or to his seed through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. An argument about the validity or the contemporary nature requirement of circumcision. Not a word about baptism. Then in his epistle to the Galatians, chapter 2 and verse 3, Galatians 2:3, I think you first of all have this reference to Titus. Neither Titus, who was with me being a Greek, was compelled to be circumcised. So Titus was not circumcised. Then in chapter 5, verses 1 through 6, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. See, some people would argue, how in the world could Paul really be referring to a stipulation of the covenant of Abraham and the law of Moses The covenant of Abraham that he so eloquently discusses in chapter 3 of this book, how could he refer to that as the yoke of bondage? Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to do the whole law. Christ is become of no effect unto you. Whosoever of you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace. For we through the Spirit wait for the hope of righteousness by faith. For in Jesus Christ neither circumcision availeth anything, nor uncircumcision, but faith which worketh by love. And then in chapter 6, verses 12 through 18, that I believe we won't look at now, but we'll take a look at later. Galatians 6, verses 12 to 18. You can just put a note out there, see later. We'll come back to that later on. Now, in the passages on baptism, maybe most notable in Paul's writings would appear Romans 6. Romans 6. Baptism is discussed always from a Christian perspective. We don't find in Paul's writings a discussion over now, is baptism necessary, or what is the worth of Jewish baptism, or whatever. We're not finding that in Paul's writings. Now, if we go back to the book of Acts and the Gospels, we go back to the 5 historical books of the New Testament. Well, we'll have to go back that early to find any type of discussion in literal experience with Jewish baptism. And of course that all revolves around John the Baptist, the one who baptized, John the Baptist. This is certainly something that's pre-Christian. It is Jewish. He was a Jew, baptizing Jews around. And in Acts 19, that's why I have to include Acts with the Gospels. In Acts 19, Paul, remember, comes across a group of 12 men at Ephesus who knew only the baptism of John. And, by the way, Paul then goes on to re-baptize these men who had already been baptized with the baptism of John. Now, you see, baptism, we're not going to go very far in this because baptism is a huge, explosive issue and question here. All of the different ins and outs and avenues of the modes and the peoples and prospects and history of baptism. But we're seeing from the gospel accounts there that there's something to John's baptism, because whenever Jesus is asked a question by the Jewish leaders, he said, well, let me ask you one. From whence comes John's baptism? Is it from above or from below? And remember, they reason, well, if we say it's from below, then the people will stone us because they take him as a prophet from God. If we say above, then Jesus will say, well, why don't you be baptized and follow the teachings of John? And John was simply a forerunner, harbinger of me, the Messiah. So it was a catch-22, to borrow the title of a book written back in the 50s that has become part of American speech now. It was a catch-22 for them. And so they said, well, we don't have an answer. So he said, well, I won't answer you either. But that's not to say that we don't come across many different references to baptism in the New Testament. Or let me say it another way. All right, no, let's say it that way. Baptism, but let's don't just think of baptism as a person being put under the water. For instance, Mark chapter 7, verses 1 through 8. Then came together unto him the Pharisees, all right, Jews here, and scribes. They'd come from Jerusalem. They're not diaspora Jews then. When they saw some of his disciples eat bread with defiled. Mark, writing to Gentile writers, has to explain what does he mean by defiled. Defiled, that is to say, unwashen. Or to use another term, unbaptized. Hands, they found fault. And so he explains for his Gentile writers the procedure of the Jewish people. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, who? For the Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding the tradition of the elders. And when they come from the market, except they wash, they eat not. And many other things there be, which they have received to hold, as the washing of cups and pots, brazen vessels, and of tables. And the Pharisees and scribes, see, that's his introduction to this argument that's going to ensue. Why walk not thy disciples according to the tradition of elders, but eat bread with unwashen hands? And he said, well, why do you walk according to the tradition of elders and you lay aside the commandment of God, which is of more importance? He said, you lay aside, verse 8, the commandment of God, you hold the tradition of men. Some examples, the washing of pots and cups, and many other such things ye do. In other words, what I'm trying to alert you to here is the fact that this issue of water, whether we want to use washing or baptism, this issue of water in some ceremonial sense was a very dominant issue in the 1st century A.D. among the Jewish people. The issue of water. He goes on to criticize them here in verse 8 for the washing of pots and cups. But that's not brought out until the end of verse 4. Because how it started, the first 3 verses, was the washing of their own person, their own hands, except they washed off when they come from the marketplace, then they're not going to eat. Then that goes into the washing of cups and pots and tables and brazen vessels and all this. And so what you get a picture of is the Niagara Falls of ceremonial cleansing here. On all the vessels and the house and the clothes and the hands and the elbows, and then maybe that just leads right up into the whole discussion of baptism. Let's look at something else. Hebrews chapter 6. Just introducing for right now. Baptism, question of the rite of baptism. Hebrews 6, verses 1 and 2. Said, let's don't lay again foundations for these elementary doctrines of Christ. Some of these being, verse 2, of the doctrine of baptisms, the teaching of baptisms. Teaching of baptisms, plural. I wonder what the writer of Hebrews has reference to here. Some of your translations will even give of the doctrine or the teaching of washings. I don't think the NIV does that, but I know some translations do. The doctrine or the teaching of washings instead of baptisms. But in either case, it is plural. Baptisms. It's always been something interesting for anyone who studies Hebrews 6. When you study it in light of, let's say, Ephesians 4, there's one faith, one Father, one Lord, one what? Baptism. Ephesians 4, one baptism. And over here, another writer of the New Testament uses baptisms plural. And then in Hebrews 9 and verse 10, the author is speaking of the earthly tabernacle and sanctuary, contrasting it with that which was to come, that of which the earlier was simply a type or a shadow, which was a figure for the time then present, in which were offered both gifts and sacrifices that could not make him that did the service perfect as pertaining to the conscience, which stood, verse 10, Hebrews 9, which stood only in meats and drinks and divers washings. Divers washings. I think the NIV has various ceremonial washings. Divers washings and carnal ordinances imposed on them until the time of Reformation. So although some people question the actual existence of this, since we don't see Paul speaking of baptism with the Judaizing position as background material, I think that in view of the fact that the Jewish religion was one of a profusion of ritual washings that could be easily demonstrated from the Old Testament narrative. But in view of the fact that the Jewish religion was one of a profusion of ritual washings, and to me it would seem unlikely that a Gentile could be converted without cleansing. The cleansing would certainly be something that was ceremonial, but they would think that it has a spiritual significance to it. So we're back to sign and significance again. The literal cleansing of the water would symbolize the spiritual cleansing of the inner life. But in any case, whether or not we find it in the New Testament or Paul, the rabbis have much to say about it. And so let me just point out a couple of other things. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, when it said, well, I don't know how we got this baptism, Paul never talks about it. It's not found in the Old Testament. Well, Paul speaks of baptism here in some, at least symbolical way. I mean, at least symbolical, if not more, whenever he refers to the Jewish people in the Exodus passing through the water and through the cloud in baptism. Verse 2, or the end of verse 1, all our fathers were under the cloud, all passed through the sea, and were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. All were what? Baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. I don't know that Paul is totally silent about the issue of Jewish baptism. He does appear to be silent with respect to a Judaizing background. But silent, period, I don't think so. In other words, Paul just speaks of baptism from a Christian perspective. I don't know that that's so true when you take into account 1 Corinthians 10:2, as well as when you take into account for whomever wrote the epistle to the Hebrews, the book of Hebrews, chapters 6 and 9. So I would again, let me say this sentence again, and then I want to go on, and I'll just have a few more things to say here. That in view of the fact that the Jewish religion was one of a great emphasis on various ritual washings, remember with the priests and the garments and all of the animals, and this has to be rinsed and that has to be washed. In view of that fact, then I would say it's unlikely that a Gentile could be converted without some external sign of cleansing. Without some external sign of cleansing. Okay, so let's enter one discussion. The discussion of, well, how old then was this rite of, let's call it Jewish baptism? Well, again, we're going to either look through the window or step back through the door of ancient history and enter the argument that is very current today as to how old the custom was for a proselyte to be required to be baptized. Well, in this discussion, two theories have arisen. I will call them the recent and the ancient theory. So if we start under baptism, then I'll start by looking under these two theories here, the recent and the ancient. The recent would hold, we don't find any evidence in the New Testament really about proselytes having, not talking about Christians now, Judaism, with proselytes being baptized. We don't really find any of that. And so baptism as a rite for proselytism is something that's rather late in Jewish history, or from our point of reference, something that's rather recent. Let's say, maybe 2nd to 3rd century then. Because we're not finding any references. This is the recent theory. They argue that the earliest rabbinical documentary evidence for its existence, earliest rabbinical documentary evidence for its existence goes back only to early 1st century AD. Then, of course, the argument, as I've already given you these later dates here, would be, they played around with it as an argument, a rabbinical debate early, but it didn't really come into effect until 2nd or 3rd century AD. The earliest rabbinical documentary evidence for the existence of baptism as a rite of requirement for a Gentile convert dates only as early as the 1st century AD in the dispute between rabbis Shammai and Hillel. Between rabbis Shammai and Hillel. Shammai Hillel. in a dispute, another rabbinical dispute here. So we're back to the debates of the rabbis. We saw earlier the one between Eliezer and Joshua. That's a century after the one between Shammai and Hillel. And we'll give you what that dispute was between Shammai and Hillel later. I just mentioned again Eliezer and Joshua. Maybe I can even go back and try to prove something real quickly from that before I go on. What I said about the arguments and the dispute, the debate between Eliezer and Joshua, was that it really revolved around the question of baptism and not circumcision. They had taken it out of its context. So maybe this would even help prove that. Rabbis Shammai and Hillel are discussing the subject of baptism as early as the early part of the 1st century A.D. And so it would only make sense that Eliezer and Joshua are going to be discussing the same thing during the same century, a little bit later, but nevertheless still discussing not so much circumcision but baptism. Anyway, the recent theory would hold that if baptism had a recent origin, which is what they believe. This is the recent proponents here. If baptism had a recent origin, it would not be universally established, and thus would still be open for debate during the time of Shammai and Hillel. It's a very logical argument. All it is a chronological argument. Let me give that to you again. If baptism is of a recent date of origin, then it would not be universally established. If it's something they still choose to debate, then it's not a norm that's established among all the Jewish people, and thus would still be open to dispute. And they really like to point to this bit of evidence that we've also mentioned earlier. We looked at the rites of proselytism, that baptism could never have been critically important. So let's say that. Baptism could never have become the critical thing that we see it to be later in Jewish history, 2nd and 3rd century A.D., until after a certain date. What date would that be? Why would it become a critical issue? If it becomes critical, that must mean it takes the place of something else that used to be critical. We gave this to you here a while back. What date? There's a date. A.D. what? Give me the two numbers. 70. The fall of the temple meant no more sacrifice. Maybe that's going to water down some other things like circumcision. Both of those things being so old, they go way back to the early pages of Genesis, and maybe that would then lift the need for an emphasis on baptism. So the critical need for it would come, they argue, only after the destruction of the temple in A.D. 70. Basically because of sacrifice. Sacrifice could no longer be offered. So maybe baptism would be offered in its place. And then there's the ancient view. They would argue something like this. If the critical need did not arise until A.D. 70, as the recent people are saying, if the critical need did not arise until A.D. 70, then why do we have it being such a chief discussion during the lives of Shammai and Hillel, who lived 70 years prior to that time? In other words, I would think that rabbis Eliezer and Joshua, who were living around A.D. 100, that would be the time for it to be a critical discussion. But it's a very critical discussion during the times of Shammai and Hillel, who lived, way back in 1 B.C. Just around the year 0, I'm saying. So this is a good view for the ancient people here. They've got something on their side. The critical need doesn't arise for baptism until A.D. 70, and those people, the recent ones, are seeing baptism kind of as something that's a substitute for sacrifice. Then why do we have it discussed during the lives of Shammai and Hillel? If it is being discussed in public disputes by the early 1st century A.D., the ancient people would argue that can only mean it's been in practice among the people for quite some time before that. In other words, we're seeing two different views of history, I think, from these people. The recent people, to give you their argument again, if it had a recent origin, it would not be universally established, and so would still be open to dispute. The recent people are almost saying that dispute about the issue comes first, and then people practice it later on. Therefore, the practice would be late in Jewish history, or from our time reference, recent. You see, they've got two different views of history here. The ancient people would say, no, people always practice something first before the scholars ever get into disputing it. Okay? So if Hillel and Shammai are disputing, let's go back to the recent. Recent would be this. This is really what you need to explain what I'm trying to explain about this position here. If they are disputing it, let's say around the year 0, then people probably won't practice it until way the end of the 1st century or over into the 2nd century A.D. So baptism as a necessary rite for proselytism is something that's rather recent. The ancient people would argue, no, since they are disputing it around the year 0, same issue is right here. They're disputing it around the year 0. People have probably been practicing that for quite a number of years prior.
For the continuation of the
ancient people would argue, no, since they are disputing it around the year 0, same issue is right here. They're disputing it around the year 0. People have probably been practicing that for quite a number of years prior. And I think that the ancient people would have in their favor such scriptures as what I just read earlier, Mark 7, verse 3. For the Pharisees and all the Jews, we're talking about, let's just say the year AD 30 to round it off. We're talking about the year AD 30. The Pharisees and all the Jews, except they wash their hands oft, eat not, holding what? The tradition of the elders. That means it's something that antedates them by a number of years to have become the tradition of the elders. And we're talking about AD 30 right there. So I think that the practice of it is going to have to go back quite some time early. Now you can see through this all that there are potential problems with both arguments, whether you're a recent or an ancient proponent. It's certain that one of the views must be right. Some people argue, well, the lack of profuse early evidence precludes a dogmatic attachment to one position or the other. But we can certainly speak of it as being present during the life of Jesus and Paul and the early church. Baptisms were very frequent in the pool of Siloam. Jesus sent a man there to wash in John 9:7. John 9:7, the blind man was sent to the pool of Siloam. We find from earlier Jewish writings that many ceremonial washings took place in this pool. And so I would favor this position, that baptism is not a new rite of the late 1st century, that is, in practice of the late 1st century A.D., but it's something that's ancient. Now, just how far it goes back, and I'm not talking about the Jews in 1 Corinthians 10 baptized as symbol, whatever Paul means by that. I'm talking about when a man who's a Gentile wants to convert to Judaism, then he must be baptized. He must be baptized. How far that goes back, I can't say. And I don't know that anyone can say definitely and dogmatically, persuasively so, how far that goes back in Jewish history. But let's just say that it's probably safe to assume that since Hillel and Shammai are discussing the issue vehemently around the year 0, of baptism for Gentile converts, then I think for several centuries prior to them, or let's be conservative, for at least 1 century prior to them, Gentiles were being baptized as converts to Judaism. Let's just return for a moment to this argument of Shammai and Hillel, and I'll tell you what it was now that we've talked about it, and using it pretty much for proof that the rite of baptism was a little older than maybe some people would have us imagine. Basically, it was over the question of time, more specifically the time interval that was to legally be allowed between the proselytes' circumcision and their baptism. We know that circumcision would come first and baptism would follow. How long of a time interval should we allow? How much time should elapse between the proselyte circumcision and their baptism? This was the discussion that was very heatedly and vehemently discussed between Shammai and Hillel, as well as their disciples, because they represented 2 schools of Jewish thought among the rabbis, basically the liberals and the conservatives. And they happen, just to give you another tidbit to show how all of this does tie into New Testament studies, they just happen to be the 2 men, along with their disciples, so we should say their philosophy or their views, the 2 schools behind the question of divorce and remarriage in Matthew 19. And if you knew that, and you knew what their argument was concerning divorce and remarriage, what Shammai held versus what Hillel held, then that would give you the facts by which you could better interpret Matthew 19. Of course, you could still juggle the facts dishonestly and come up with a misinterpretation of Matthew 19, but you could hardly ever come to truth without a factual basis. So that's the argument. How long should we allow? What's the law say? What's the spirit of the law say? What have the rabbis taught? What should be the practice? How much time should elapse between circumcision and baptism? Well, on the one hand, Shammai taught that you could receive both on the same day, that they were both important acts, and they should not be separated by any time, but the sooner they could be performed, the better. Of course, you could always have the sad situation of the proselyte dying in between circumcision and baptism if you allowed too much time to elapse there. So he cuts the Gordian knot by saying, we'll put them both on the same day, and that'll take care of that. On the other hand, Hillel taught that the law taught there should be a 7-day interval, 1-week interval. That was the argument. By the time of the council at Jerusalem, approximately AD 49, Jesus has ascended, and Paul and the apostles are out doing the work of the ministry. Hillel's view has prevailed and won out. By the time of AD 50, let's say, Hillel's view has successfully fought the view of Shammai and has prevailed. That is, that there is to be a 7-day interval between the proselytes' circumcision and their baptism. And Hillel had a couple of points that he wanted to make. First of all, he argued, on the basis of the Old Testament, 2 verses I'll give you here in just a moment, Hillel argued, that's Hillel, Hillel. Hillel argued that you would have to have at least a week, at least 7 days, to physically heal up from the surgical process, circumcision, before one would be ready for the waters of baptism. Baptizing in water on the same day could be painful, not to speak of dangerous to one's health, because of bacteria or something in the water. Someone could actually end up dead from baptism on the same day you were circumcised because you have not had time to heal up. And there were 2 case examples. He didn't have something from earlier rabbis, but he had something from the rabbi Moses in writing the Pentateuch here. He had 2 case examples back in the Old Testament, one in Genesis and one with Moses' follower Joshua, that he felt proved that some time interval should be allowed. The first of those would be Genesis 34 and verse 25. Genesis 34:25. Here you have the case of the Hivites, one of their leaders, Shechem, seducing Dinah, one of the daughters of Israel. And you know the story here. Through deception and trickery, all of these men are slain. But the way it comes about would be verse 25. It came to pass on the third day, so this is 3 days later, when they were sore. Now you know the story here. He said, if you'll circumcise all the men in your village, then we'll give our daughters to your sons, and we can take your sons to our daughters. So the third day they're still sore from circumcision. That two of the sons of Jacob, Simeon and Levi, Dinah's brothers, took each man his sword, and came upon the city boldly, and slew all the males. Well, that's quite a feat. Of course, we'd have to go into some other Old Testament exegesis here. Does Moses, in writing this, intend for us to infer that Simeon and Levi were the only two that were involved in this massacre here? That's rather almost well-nigh unbelievable, I guess, to think that two men can go into a whole city, unless maybe we take into consideration this business of circumcision. When you're a full-grown man and you're circumcised, and the biblical account says it was the third day, and it says they were sore, then for Hillel that would say something. A person, in other words, is not ready for baptism on the same day that he's circumcised. He's not ready 3 days later, because this would prove it. The men were still sore, so let's wait 7 days. The other biblical account he had was in Joshua 5:8. It's funny how different scriptures were used, really out of their context, but were used because they were narrative history here. Joshua 5:8. Here we have the account of all of these boys who have been born in wilderness wandering and have grown up now to be men, but they weren't circumcised, and all of the rebellion out there in the wilderness. And so that was one of the laws that God gave here in verse 2, make these sharp knives and circumcise again the children of Israel. And so verse 8, it came to pass when they had done circumcising all the people that they abode in their places in the camp till they were whole. And we don't have a time period here, but it was obviously not that evening that they were whole and then they could go on. It was a lapse of several days, surely, before they were able to do the next thing God wanted them to do. So he had these two scriptures on his side in arguing against Shammai. Then the second thing Hillel argued was that due to the fact that these proselytes were Gentiles, Gentile impurity, he said, was of the same magnitude as that of a corpse. Notice he's saying this even after their circumcision. He doesn't see the whole process evidently completed yet until they've gone through all of these steps. And if you go back several weeks ago to a message entitled The Admissions Procedure, then baptism was the fifth step there. He said that Gentile impurity was of the same magnitude, on the same order, as the impurity of a corpse. And so, according to Numbers 19:16, the biblical time interval between circumcision and baptism would have to be 7 days. Now you'll want to look at Numbers 19:16 real quickly. We don't want to spend a lot of time here. And whosoever toucheth one that is slain with a sword in the open fields, or a dead body, or a bone of a man, or a grave. Remember over in Matthew 23, he calls them whitewashed sepulchres there. Whitewashed, they wanted to make sure that they could spot them, because they knew if you touched one of those, you became unclean. And if you were going to Jerusalem for Passover, and you were that unlucky soul that touched a grave and found out later that you had touched it, you would be unclean. You couldn't eat Passover. You'd wasted your time and your trip. So they painted them white every spring to make sure that the people would avoid the graves. Or a grave shall be unclean 7 days. Numbers 19:16. So, of course, what he had to do is first of all make the initial step, and that is to connect the impurity, the ceremonial impurity of a corpse, to the ceremonial impurity of a Gentile, a proselyte into Judaism. And once you made that connection, then a Gentile's a dead man. And you're not really, remember, that newborn child until after baptism. When you come up from baptism, you're that newborn child. That was the term that the rabbis always used. So a Gentile was a dead man. If he's a dead man, then he's impure for 7 days. And so you circumcise him, wait 7 days, baptize him, then you've got the whole process down pat. And you may also want to note later on John 18:28. John 18:28. Not speaking of baptism, but definitely speaking of Gentile ceremonial impurity. The religious leaders made sure they didn't go into certain Gentile residences because they wanted to eat the Passover. That's John 18 and verse 28. Now the rabbis fixed elaborate explanations on the legitimacy of baptism. We've toyed with that a little earlier, and we'll look at it again quickly now and here at this point. In other words, the origin, the legitimacy, the origin. I mean, who gave the original statute that commanded that proselytes be baptized? They had to have something to prove that this was legitimate, that this was valid. So some of the rabbis, and their extended zeal to prove its origin and its legitimacy, carried proselyte baptism as far back as Genesis 35:2. They founded proselyte baptism here on one little phrase in Genesis 35:2. Jacob said unto his household and to all that were with him, this is after God has appeared to him again, put away the strange gods that are among you, and be clean, and change your garments. And be clean. They took that phrase, and be clean. Water symbolizes ceremonial cleansing, or cleanliness. Well, the only problem, well, I won't say the only, one among many, in using Genesis 35:2 is it speaks of Hebrews here. Their purification, the rite of cleansing for them. And we don't even exactly know what all entailed in this phrase, be clean. So if that didn't work, they had another one that they even favored more than Genesis 35:2. You pick this out in the writings of the rabbis. And that was Exodus 19:10. Again, another problem is this concerned the Jewish people and not Gentiles. Exodus 19 is the prelude to the giving of the moral law, the Decalogue, the 10 Commandments in Exodus 20. And remember, one of the things here was to wash your clothes. Verse 10, the Lord said unto Moses, go unto the people, sanctify them today and tomorrow, let them wash their clothes. In other words, we've got the subject of water here. If you can get water, you can somehow wrench baptism out of it. Some other evidences as to how they would explain this, how they would legitimize the practice of proselyte baptism. The Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan. The Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan, which dated from the 6th or 7th century A.D. And that's on Lit Tape 96. Thankfully, here's another area where we can cross-reference. And if you don't remember much about it, the Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan, thankfully it's one of those things you don't have to remember a lot about. The Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan, Lit Tape 96, we discussed that. On Exodus 12:44, Targums were explanations, remember. Or if you don't, now you can be told. On Exodus 12:44, we've looked at 48 before, that both the homeborn and the alien man, if he wanted to partake of the Passover, had to be circumcised. Remember, the whole chapter 12 of Exodus deals with the Passover, and so we get circumcision here in the end. Verse 44, the Targum is an explanation, paraphrase. The Targum of Pseudo-Jonathan read as follows, but every man's servant that is bought for money, now that'd be an alien, a Gentile, when thou hast circumcised and baptized him, then shall he eat thereof. Now they've got an interpolation here with this phrase, and baptize. Circumcise and baptize him. will then be allowed to eat the Passover. So that's an interesting reference. Then if you flip over to Matthew 23:15, I'll give you what the Ethiopic version has to say. This is on Lit Tape 124, where we discuss the Ethiopic translation of the New Testament. The Ethiopic translation, Lit Tape 124, on Matthew 23:15, which happens to be one of our three proselyte passages in the New Testament. Reads as follows: Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye compass sea and land to baptize one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Again, another interpolation here with the term baptism. For ye compass sea and land to baptize one proselyte. So the rabbis had various excuses. Of course, Ethiopic version, that goes beyond explanations of the rabbis. But the rabbis had various verses on which they could base baptism. The whole question of baptism, as we've said several times in these recent studies, is one that's simply beyond the scope of what we're looking at right now. And so finally then, with the rites, the three chief rites, circumcision, baptism, let's come to sacrifice. Number 3, sacrifice. It's the briefest one and the easiest one to discuss. It was relatively nailed shut as far as discussion was concerned. Now for the proselyte, sacrifice began with a pair of turtle dove or 2 pigeons, which was the offering of the poor in the Old Testament. It began with a pair of turtle dove or 2 pigeons. Once he's gone through the initial rites of proselytism, he's gone through circumcision, baptism, he has had the children of the wise standing around him at his pool of baptism, yelling to him as the initiate, the light and the heavy commandments. Once he's gone through all of this, once he has presented himself at the temple and he's offered 2 turtle dove or 2 pigeons, then, as we've somewhat seen earlier, he's pretty much counted then as a Jew. So from there on out, the Levitical law of sacrifice is imposed upon him. In other words, what I'm saying here is that he would have to offer the regular sacrifice that was required of any Jew, any Israelite, for whatever period, whatever episode we're talking about. What was normative for the Jew was normative for the Gentile proselyte. For instance, he had to make the annual Passover pilgrimage to Jerusalem, just like a Jew. His sins also had to be covered in the Day of Atonement, Leviticus 16, and so forth. But this requirement of sacrifice, of course, was discontinued after the destruction of the temple in AD 70. But then, do you remember what followed after the destruction of the temple? The proselyte had to make a vow that whenever the temple was restored and rebuilt, then he would come back and offer sacrifice. But whenever it's destroyed, then sacrifice, not only for the Jew, but obviously for the Gentile proselyte, would be discontinued. Discontinued indefinitely, but for them discontinued until the hope and the prophecies of the latter prophets had been fulfilled. The temple in its latter stage had been rebuilt. Now, with all of these requirements, some of them painful in the body, some of them painful regarding social standing, it has been asked, what caused these Gentiles, the ones who became full proselytes, the proselytes of righteousness, the proselytes with a right motive, what caused these Gentiles to convert? Put yourself in their place. Would you have converted to a religion like the Jewish faith? With all of its various stipulations, it has its own religious history, it has its own sacred scriptures, and if that's not enough, there is pain in the body and pain in the mind to be experienced whenever you convert. So why would you convert to a religion like Judaism? Well, let me give you 3 reasons why they converted. It could be for one or the other of these, or more likely a combination of these, was involved whenever a Gentile converted. We have them with our white coats and our microscopes. We have them under inspection here. What is Gentile proselytism, the Jewish faith here in the 1st century A.D.? But it was something very real for them. They went from paganism over to the true religion. There was only religion in the world that was true. Let's go back prior to 1st century A.D. Only religion in the world that's true. They converted. How? Why? What would cause such a not turning back from episode in their life? Well, here's one suggestion. Number one, loneliness. I think we all know that the heathen world can be a very lonely place to live. Even when you're surrounded by other like-minded heathens. Maybe that's what makes it that much more lonely of a place in which to live. Some of the loneliest people in the world are the tramps and bag ladies among New York's millions. So you can have lots of people around, but people don't satisfy the need of companionship and fellowship. It says a lot then about the strong community attachment that was very evident among the diaspora Jews. It was like a haven or a shelter for many. A very strong community attachment among the diaspora Jews. Now, you can have community attachment for various reasons. It can be forced upon one, which is really not community then, or one can gravitate toward community for reasons of religion, for reasons of one's spiritual heritage, or whatever. But we know several things are combined here in the strong community that was expressed among the diaspora Jews. And a man living out there in the pre-Christian, pagan, heathen world, and he looked at the Jews and he saw people that loved each other. The mother and father, see, they had been given laws in the Old Testament against divorce, against all of these sins that the pagans were just committing all the time. It should be like what the world sees when it looks at the church today. Amen. That the church has been given certain laws. She's not allowed to divorce. She should be community-centered. She should be family-centered. And the pagans, the heathens, could look at that and say, they've got a good family life. The children enjoy being with the parents. The children respect their parents. They don't get a divorce whenever they grow up. Their parents aren't divorced. Their grandparents aren't divorced. They seem to have peace and harmony and tranquility in their own mind and in their own midst there. Amen. And so although I've got a lot of so-called advantages out here in the world being a heathen or a pagan, I don't have anything compared to what these Jews have. And so it was a very lonely place to live as a heathen out there in the world. You don't have any fellowship at all, no true fellowship. So they would convert. A second reason, they might be intellectually convinced of the superiority of Judaism. Judaism in parenthesis, maybe. Really, we're talking about the religion of the Old Testament, not as it was perverted by the rabbis. But intellectually convinced by writings, of course, we're talking about, or it could be arguments in the marketplace or whatever. But the Jews, I would say probably, we don't have a lot of great statesmen from the Jewish people. We don't have philosophers from the Jews. We do have historians. We do have some writers. If we have a philosopher, he's going to end up as a writer. So rather than get converted intellectually in the marketplace, it probably happened at home or in the library as they were reading writings of people like Philo. It was written as an apology, a defense of Judaism in the face of heathenism. Josephus has some writings the same way. The letter of Aristeas. If you don't remember where we've seen that before, that gave us our legend for the origin of the Septuagint. 70 scholars in 70 days, translated out here on an island off Alexandria. The Sibylline oracles. The Greeks were famous for their Delphi oracles, but the Jews had theirs, the Sibylline oracles. So they could have become intellectually convinced of the superiority of the Jews' faith. And then number 3, the high spiritual and ethical values of Judaism. Its monotheism, its high expression of morality, may have convinced them. Again, we're talking about the inherent superiority of Judaism. Spiritually, with their monotheism, which was unique in the world of their day, and ethically with their high expressions of morals, which also was unique in their day. And let me conclude this little part of our study with a quote from, it's short, I'd like for you to get it down, from Josephus in his Against Atheon 2, I think it's 38. And Contra Atheon, Against Atheon, which happens to be one of these things here that intellectually would convince others. Here's what Josephus had to say in Contra Atheon 2:38. You can look up in your Josephus writings. Let me quote, "The greatest miracle of all is that our law holds no seductive bait of sensual pleasure, but has exercised this influence through its own inherent merits." It's not like the Greeks it's not like the mystery religions that hold as seductive bait sensual pleasures that can be experienced. We don't offer anything like that. So why have all these people converted? The greatest miracle of all is that our law holds no seductive bait of sensual pleasure, but has exercised this influence through its own inherent merits. That would tie in with our last 2 points there. Intellectually they were convinced because of the inherent superiorities, spiritually and ethically, of the Jewish faith. The greatest miracle of all is that our law holds no seductive bait of sensual pleasure, but has exercised this influence through its own inherent merits.